What was the main purpose for forming another government, NPRAG, within Liberia, leading to the greater and the lesser Liberia coexisting between 1991 to 1997? Okay, why couldn't we unite at that time and just go forward? Is it the same concept of the lack of national identity factor or the unexpected political failures of 1990 after Doe's death, or what? How would you like to answer that as succinct as possible? Because we noticed that it was that struggle between these two groups that led to a 7-year period of such intense bloodshed and confusion that our history would never, I hope, repeat that. So I was just wondering, what was the core reason why it had to be that way?
I thank you, Mr. Commissioner Coleman, for that question. It was a combination, I believe, of both. This is perhaps what has led me to the conclusion that our problems are essentially political. Now, without finger pointing, you will recall, let's start off from where Minister Buya left off and do a connection there. The NPRAG was not named out of the blue sky. Although I said to you earlier, they had the MPFA had that military objective of removing President Doe. They were not removing President Doe to sit back and cheer someone else to take over. They had objectives of taking over the leadership once he was removed. That was to be expected. Anyone who did not expect that was either naive or had their own reasons for not expecting that. In any case, I believe the leader of the MPFL, Mr. Taylor, was influenced and persuaded to announce on July 26, 1990, what I call a path to ending the military hostility. And that was, he would, upon having received a resolution, and here again I want to step forward another stipulation, that not all of the political leaders signed that resolution, but the MPFL was persuaded to believe that all of them were contacted and that all had given the acquiescence to that resolution, famously now known as the Bintumani resolution. And essentially what it said was, look, the bloodshed has to stop. Mr. Taylor and his MPFL now controls the vast majority of the country. Monrovia must be spared this bloodbath, this final showdown of President Doe. So Mr. Taylor proceed at the head of a government to form a government of some kind of national color, meaning bring on board all of us and establish a time frame for elections. Now, with that resolution in hand, I believe Mr. Taylor, I was in Monrovia. I was in Monrovia then. Mr. Taylor proceeded to announce the government. And what I remember about that announcement very well was that it named only a few ministers. It named him as head, as was recommended by the Bintumani resolution, and only a few ministers were named. Now, on yesterday, Mr. Commissioner Stewart asked me, perhaps Mr. Taylor did not do what was requested of him fully. I'm paraphrasing what Commissioner Stewart asked. And I tried to get Mr. Commissioner Stewart to see that the reason some of these posts, I will understand later, were left vacant was expressly for the business of attracting or awarding them to these political leaders who had provided either acquiescence, tacit support, or had actually signed this document. Think back, Mr. Commissioner Coleman, that if that had been done, what would have been the need for further conflict? The only issue that would have been left unresolved was how, by what means, President Doe, who was still in the executive mansion, the seat of power, would have been provided some kind of exit. Think back and imagine the possibility of changing the course of history, the possibility of not going down the road of that further bloodletting. Had that just happened, but it did not. History will show the war continued. And why? Tragically, some of the same elements who persuaded Mr. Taylor to form that government. Now, I will even argue, how was Mr. Taylor to announce a time frame for elections when those elements who even wanted that time frame for the elections were not even on board of that government yet? It seemed to me that you will announce the government, you will put the pressure on President Doe, and then, this is just an analysis now, you put the pressure on President Doe, and once these other political leaders came on board, it would provide that government, the new MPRG government, added motivation and incentives, and persuade the larger international community and perhaps ECOWAS, who at the time has started to toy with the possibility of intervention, will be persuaded that, look, we have a government, we have resolved this matter, it is now left to persuade President Doe so that that government can be installed. We agree that we will hold over for this length of period. No such thing happened. Now, in August of that year, now I did not go to Banjul. I was displaced like everybody else in hiding. In August of 1990, essentially the same group or the core thereof, and I understand it must have amounted to 20, it could have been more than 21, 22 number of people, met in Banjul, the Gambia, and overturned that process. I argued in my paper that two motivations collided. On the one hand, Mr. Taylor's MPFL represented a bad omen for the region, whose leadership at the time comprised military leaders themselves, who were being held up in power by the entrenchment of their own military, or leaders who had been head of the government since independence, and the fear was of a domino or boomerang effect on their own societies. So that combined with the motivations of political leaders, and I told you the problem has always been political power, combined to say, look, here was this man with 95% control of the country announcing himself leader. It is about time that we join ECOWAS, which is a group now getting increasingly dissatisfied with the success of that unit to form a new government. So what happened? Banjul raised not just a new government, but a new political slogan and formula that started to attend the project, and that was, the guns that liberate cannot rule. What did that do? It effectively expurgated President Taylor. Okay.
Did that slogan come out of Banjul?
Well, I tell you one thing that happened in Banjul, and this can be confirmed by the participants. Prince Johnson, I believe, was invited to Banjul and attended that conference. But the slogan that came out, and I am told subsequently, and you can confirm that with participants at the conference, was that the head of the transitional arrangement, and I understand this is why perhaps Dr. Sawyer got the nod, will not contest the ensuing presidential elections. It says to me, when people therefore started with all of this, the guns that liberate cannot rule, the guns that liberate cannot rule, it became almost clear that this political design from Banjul will be combined with a military experience, and both put together will effectively eliminate Mr. Taylor. It was not unsurprising to me, Mr. Commissioner Coleman, that Mr. Taylor then became, for lack of a better word, intransigent. And then the sense of deception and animosity and the long conflict began. And all was for what? Power. And mind you, Mr. Boyer's account will show that President Doe was in the executive mansion when the conference happened in Banjul, the Gambia. Is that correct? Is that correct? Yeah. And Dr. Sawyer was named. I stand to be correct, Mr. Chairman. Is that correct? This meeting happened in August of 1990 in Banjul, the Gambia. President Doe was captured and killed in September of 1990. It means that Liberia had a sitting president. When the political leaders and religious leaders of the country were meeting in Banjul and decided on another president. And what happened? That government was immediately formed, positions were given in Banjul, people became ministers, and those were the same progressives who perhaps hold this design that the other progressives who served Mr. Taylor were doing it only for money, but those who served the IGNU were doing it because they loved the country. But here is what happened. That government, after distributing positions mostly to the progressives, look back on the roster, mostly to the progressives, ended up where? In Sierra Leone for a while until President Doe was killed. And while in Sierra Leone, headquartered, I understand, at the Mamiyoko Hotel, all rights and privileges appertaining to the President of the Republic of Liberia, not just the president, but the entire government. People were wallowing there in Sierra Leone under the name of ministers and signing documents as ministers. They were accorded until President Doe was captured and killed. Obviously, Mr. Taylor, like any other person alive, would feel betrayed and abandoned. And so he decided that he will hold in his own hands and that of the MPFL his ultimate destiny and fate. And so he pronounced, because of the award because of the conduct of that meeting under the guise of under the banner of ECOWAS, that a military force called ECOMOG coming to Liberia will be opposed by the MPFL. A new form of, you can understand why. Here was ECOWAS providing, so to speak, tacit support, providing the stage, providing the venue for a meeting that produced a government. Now, was the MPFL invited to that meeting in the Gambia? The MPFL was. But I am told that Mr. Thomas Wowiyu, who headed the MPFL delegation to the Gambia, was arrested at the airport, remained in detention until after the elections or selection of that government. That is, I believe, now, perhaps Mr. Wowiyu can confirm this, perhaps those who participate will confirm. This is what I was told.
Thank you.
So, maybe, and to what level they participated, I wouldn't know. But perhaps all of that moved the purposes of the war into a new phase. It is equally mind-boggling, Mr. Commissioner Coleman, I submit to you, why people couldn't just rally and end this bloodshed that would have come about later. It was not too difficult to see that if we had not done that, the bloodshed would have escalated, the fighting would have escalated. But again, you can trace some of this suspicion, some of these doubts, some of this infighting to even the 1980 coup, where the progressives, I argue, effectively negated each other by their own desire to lead. Each saw an opportunity for them to lead and would not succumb and would not agree to another leading. So you still have this attitude about, no, I will not serve under this other person unless this person was the leader, because to do so will mean that I am abandoning the original objectives, and the original objective shared by all the progressives was to bring change here. And I stipulate further that everybody believed, it became a settled impression. No man will deceive you today. That perhaps, except Mr. Gabriel Bacchus Matthews, he must be given some credit. He said that the only way we have election in 1991 is unless President Doe was still in power. Only Mr. Matthew was on record of saying that. And for that, Mr. Matthew exacted the scorn and disdain of most of the progressives as having so loud. At the same time, he contracted the anger of the government when he also said at the Chamber of Commerce, at the press, it was a press meeting, at the Chamber of Commerce, he addressed the press. They wanted to know the possibilities for election. And he took a question and answer period. I was present when he said the only way 1991 election will happen is unless President Doe. What he was speaking to at the time was the race that the government didn't know, was that there was a race to oust the government militarily. And the settled view was by the next election, President Doe would do that which he did in 1985 and will win. So the way to do is to abort that process and remove him before 91. And Mr. Matthew was prophetically speaking to that. Whatever his faults are, let's give him that credit. But at the same time, he angered the government when he said, and if there will be cheating in the next election, there will be a bloodbath in this country. Those were the contexts at the time. And it was not good to many that Mr. Taylor became the person who rolled faster than most and came closest to the seat of power. And then it broke up again into another conflagration.
Thank you. Wow, that is very interesting theory. So, in summary, it seems you're saying the people called him to lead. He in turn responded, announced his government. Then those same people misunderstood that to mean he wanted to take power, so they decided to go for Banjul as an opposing government and the interim government. And that also brought in the element of, but then it means Doe must go, because you can't have two together. And therefore the INDPL or INDPL came about, and then he now INPFL came about, and then Taylor now then became stubborn and said, but then if that's how you're doing it, then we'd fight to the end. And that's how the so-called Greater Liberia and Lesser Liberia came about. In summary, is that basically?
Except that the MPFL broke up into INPFL long before.
Okay, that's good.
That is the only difference.
Right,
but essentially, and as you conduct these hearings, put that theory up and listen to the other political accounts, and you will see, it will become increasingly self-evident to you why I arrive at the conclusion that the problems of our country are basically political. It's a fight for power.